Everyone, thanks for joining us in this late start session in the afternoon. We apologize for this 15 minutes delay in the starting of our panel. I'm really pleased to introduce you my panelist today, Mrs. Giulia Giordano. She's a senior associate in Dentons, Rome, in my team, and Mr. Marcello Caramazza, he's the head of antitrust, and I will add FDI also on Clariant. Brief introduction myself, I'm Michele Carpagnano, I'm the head of antitrust department in Dentons, and I also teach competition law in Trento University. There is a little bit noise outside, so I apologize for this, but I guess that in a few minutes it will be resolved. We have 45 minutes this afternoon, so we will try to be very precise in the management of the timing. The object of this chat, I will define this as a chat, so you are kindly invited to interact with us, to raise your hand, even during the discussion, in order to make comments and questions, observations, remarks. Hello. The topic is the interactions between FDI, foreign direct investment screening laws, and merger control in M&A transactions. So we have a very precise objective today. To me, this is one of the most fascinating topic for lawyers, for geopolitical analysts, for economists also, because the FDI and merger control are having a strong impact on the successful outcome of complex M&A transactions globally. It is a global trend, the scrutiny of foreign investors' activities across the globe. So it's not a purely European one, it's not purely Italian one, although it should say that Italy is one of the most active authorities. The Italian government is one of the most active authorities in screening proactively, also with the ex officio powers that have been recently conferred, transactions which involves foreign investors. Please also be informed, in the benefit of our discussions, that foreign investors in the Italian legal system for certain areas means also an intra-EU investor. So big topic, big issues to discuss today. So we have a very intense outline. We spotted 8 topics. And we designed this session with a very practical and operational approach. So the idea is to have the view from the outside counsel, Giulia in this case, and an in-house counsel, Marcello, which all very often interact themselves. They are different souls that should work together in a timely manner, in a coordinated manner, with the last objective, which is the successful of the M&A transaction. So I will leave the floor to Giulia. And again, please feel free to jump in over the discussion. Please, Giulia, for you. You can skip this.
Thank you, Michele. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Then yes. I would say for a start that merger control regime and FDI regime have much in common. They are the two main regimes that worry us when dealing with M&A transactions, because we must assess these two main aspects. Of course, there are two different scrutinies, as the merger control regime is aimed at protecting competition on merits and consumer welfare, while FDI screening is more focused on national interests, such as national security and defense at the core, but then broadly expanding in the recent years, as we will get to afterwards. But they have three main points of contacts when you have to screen reportability of the transactions. First one is the relevant sectors, in the sense that FDI is a sector relevant screening. So, of course, only certain sectors fall within the scrutiny, while for merger control, it's usually market share and turnover thresholds that are relevant, but in some member states, for example, in France, there might be specific turnover thresholds depending on the sector, and also for under threshold notifications, sectors come into play. Innovation is most important. Then passing to the topic of relevant transactions, that differs in the sense that in merger control we look at a change of control, while in FDI we look at a broader scope of transactions, even contracts, even a pledge. The constitution of a pledge can be screened by FDI authorities. And as for relevant countries, they come into play. For merger control, it's mostly the turnover generation of the parties that determine the relevant countries, while for FDI it's mostly the nationality of the investor. In general, what we note, just looking at these three main questions, is that in merger control scrutiny, there is much more transparency and foreseeability of the criteria, while for FDI, which of course deals with national sovereignty, it's somehow more difficult to foresee the obligation and the possible outcomes. So the impact evaluation of such filings is the main objective of today's session. And I will pass to Marcello.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks to Lier and to the friends at Denson for inviting me. From an in-house counsel perspective, I must say the main challenge represented by the FDI is that due to the expansion, very recent expansion of sectors in which FDI filings are now required, the companies that may have been quite sophisticated in understanding the complexities of merger control filings and dealing with this regulatory burden now are faced with this new regulatory challenge of FDI. And so this is important, of course, for in-house counsel and lawyers to properly educate the executives that this is indeed a new regulatory landscape that is here to stay. The second point I wanted to make in this slide says about M&A compliance, but as Julia was saying, FDI scope is much more than that, and so deals which are not deals, which are transactions, not necessarily transfer of business, can be caught by FDI filings. From an in-house counsel perspective, these pose challenges because governance rules may give the competence and the authority of concluding certain deals to, for example, local real estate teams if it's an asset. So we have to put in place internal control and internal reporting mechanism to make sure that this deal actually don't go unnoticed and then we have a failure to file.
Excellent. So in your experience, because I want to stress that the experience of Marcello, not only is a very good friend of ours, but it's an excellent lawyer dealing in a global environment. Your company is active in more than 100 countries per turnover, 60 countries, more or less, 4 subsidiaries. So can you tell us something more about how you manage this M&A compliance?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we are going a bit more into the core of the question now, of course, and without wanting to take too much of the time, and we reserve to the other slides. I think again before going into the transaction agreements, indeed, to make sure that the teams are properly educated of what FDI is. And the first question I get is always like, okay, but I mean, we are not selling weapons or something, and we have absolutely no interest of harming a national interest in a certain country. Well, there is the first challenge to educate them about this very growing scope and quite unclear concern that authorities may raise in a country or another. And of course, then it comes when there is really an agreement or a deal or an M&A deal foreseen, and that's where indeed we start with a very, very early involvement, of course, of lawyers. And we will see cooperation with different work streams, because we will see, I mean, FDI touches much more than simple core M&A and business, but maybe we'll leave that for the rest.
So knowledge to business, it's key for in-house counsel. Julia, from your perspective for outside counsel, external counsel, can you tell us in brief what are the main points everyone should be aware of?
Yes, I think that in order to properly take into account the FDI and merger control aspects in the drafting of the M&A contract clauses, first of all, you need an impact evaluation on the filings. Means that, first of all, you have to identify which filings are mandatory. As anticipated, it is easier in merger control than in FDI because of its expansion. Of course, it's quite clear in the defense and national security sector, but less clear for the agri-food business, for instance. But in this sense, detecting mandatory filing FDI obligations is also a matter of risk assessment. Because FDI filings can create uncertainties, can delay the timelines. So once you deem you might be in the relevant sector, you will also look at the timeline, look at whether there is a standstill obligation in place, and whether, and in case the timeline is not consistent with the expecting closing date, then you look at strategic solutions. For example, you might as well want to evaluate pre-notification or voluntary notification regimes in case that the relevant jurisdiction have them. And the question is also whether pre-notification delays delays the timing or can make it quicker, because of course in some jurisdictions pre-notification is an alternative to formal notification, like in the Italian FDI regime. With a successful pre-notification you avoid formal notification, but in some cases, like in EU merger control, for instance, usually you have both. So you evaluate all these in terms of timing, and also for drafting the M&A clauses, you should have a thought at the substantive analysis that the competition authorities and the FDI authorities are likely to carry out in order to envisage upfront remedies that you want to embed in the transaction to increase the likelihood of success, or that you want to eventually put in place in case there are concerns. Yes.
Marcella, do you want to add something?
Yeah, so absolutely, and as Julia already said, and I cannot stress this enough to the external lawyer, the timeline is critical. M&A deals do not happen in a vacuum, so there is deal financing involved, there are banks, there are millions involved. Not having a clear timeline, it's just, that's the first killer of a deal. So it's very important, And of course, lawyers tend to be conservative and say, okay, let's take the longest filing, let's add a few months to it, and then we get a long stop date. But that just doesn't work in all the deals, because there are other consequences. And as a stock-listed companies, for example, Clarion needs to submit information to the stock exchange about ongoing deals and when there is a projected closing date. If this closing happens later, but even earlier than what we said, the stock exchange regulators will be in our offices asking, why did you change this closing date? Because it's price significant on our shares. So very important to have early on an estimate as reliable as possible. And with regard to the risk assessment from the in-house perspective, all I can say is that indeed traditional risk assessment of merger controls was probably done in the M&A team with the executive and the business. Risk assessment from an FDI perspective requires the involvement of, for example, the HR team. There might be key personnel involved. The R&D team, you may have technology that might need to be, might be a concern for an FDI authority. Operations, you need strategic assets, and local teams, because indeed maybe an asset for you centrally in headquarters is something minimal, but in that country is subject to a lot of publicities on the newspaper for one reason or another, and that will create an additional element of concern that must be evaluated.
If I may add, one of the best practice will be to be ready on signing with all drafts of the filings for all jurisdictions already reviewed by the parties. Is there something that you can suggest, Marcello and Giulia, based on your experience?
From my side, yes, absolutely, because especially with the FDI, merger controls, filings have a lot of overlaps in terms of market definition, market share, so you gather one big set of data. FDIs, we all know, the authorities tend to ask some bulk of the similar question, but many are different questions. So having them ready is essential, because the usual 20 business days deadline between signing and filing will not be respected if we start at signing with those filings. That's clear.
So again, an early involvement not only of the internal teams, but also the external lawyer is key for the successful of this kind of complex transactions. And also another, little piece of information from our practical experience. FDI authorities talk each other regularly. There is the FDI screening mechanism within the Europe. There are transatlantic agreements between Europe and US. So again, be consistent with the set of information that you are providing to the authority. And also, we suggest also to play a little bit with this. So if you have several proceedings ongoing and you already got a couple of clearance from key jurisdictions, inform the government, the local government, that you got already that result. So it is a work in progress that very often helps to have a unique strategy also vis-a-vis the governments and the competition authorities. We will touch this point later. As you know, competition authorities are independent from the government, and this is one of the key features of our institutional asset of competition law. The government, on the other side, are more sensible on the pressure that they receive from newspapers, as you mentioned, from other stakeholders like syndicates, labor union, etc., etc. But I don't want to anticipate other topics you will touch later on. Giulia, next point. Let's go a little bit more in detail on our operations.
Yeah, let's go in detail on the risk assessment that you should do before drafting the M&A clauses. There are two main streams of risk assessment. One to determine reportability, the other is focused on the substantive analysis. Concerning reportability, what I want to stress here, in the slide we put up all the main features that determine whether a transaction is reportable in a certain country and by which parties. But what I want to stress first is the local effect test and local nexus, which are typical of Western jurisdictions, but some exotic jurisdictions have notification obligations that merely depends on the parties exceeding certain turnover thresholds, and there the reportability of a transaction strongly depend on the view that the company takes also on the risk of detection in such countries, on their previous filing practice and so on. So reportability and risk assessment are really strongly intertwined in this sense. While for the FDI obligations, beforehand we have been preparing today's meeting, and I pointed out that's a pyramid. Michele pointed out that's more like an iceberg than a pyramid, in the sense that really the target sector and the nationality of the investors have the strongest impact, not only on the reportability but also on the substantive analysis, as FDI is subject to geopolitical changes and also frictions. So although also inter-EU transactions are relevant, for example, for the Italian FDI screening, really it's nationality specific, the risk to have possible concerns and remedies. While for merger control, you have guidances from competition authorities, you have databases from cases of competition authorities that highlight how you look at the market positioning of the parties, if you're having an horizontal or a vertical overlap. And even conglomerate mergers, which are kind of more uncertain because there are new theories of arm flourishing. Let's look at digital ecosystems, for example. Still, the fact that there are public sources plus effective judicial review, especially I can speak of the EU experience, make it more foreseeable. For FDI, of course, the concerns vary due to geopolitical tensions, but also due to the fact that strategic assets change in time. There is a transformative changing technology that we must consider, and also, for example, the fact that we now collect data that there are possibility to exploit maliciously, and we weren't really aware of that decades ago. This changes the concerns and the possible remedies. Plus, in the merger control world, remedies are often proposed by the parties and accepted by the competition authorities, while in the FDI regime, it's more like an imposition from the FDI governmental authority. So we can give examples. Some examples of remedies are duty to supply, for example, national players, or imposing veto rights of certain shareholders on strategic decisions, or abstaining from certain behaviors such as delocalization, which is a concern that is not typically in the national security interest, but often comes into play in the FDI. This is a complete new world compared to the behavioral and structural remedies of the merger control. And especially on this last note of the employment, I want to leave the floor too much energy.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, again, from the in-house, I echoed what has been said, although it's true that merger control authorities have been developing new theories of harm, and at least in the in a sector like the chemical sector, like the company I work with is, the level of concentration, of course, gives rise to necessarily to, for example, a rise in problems with conglomerate effect of mergers, and vertical, of course, quite common standard now. But still, there is a level of predictability that we are used to. While in the FDI, for example, well, nationality of investors first is we are a Swiss-based company. We have a shareholder which holds a certain percentage of our company. We are a stock exchange, so it's and the shareholder is SABIC, so the Saudi Arabian Basic Industry, which in turn is held by Saudi Aramco. So this, of course, when the FDA authority sees this, they start ringing their bells. And I can say that, I mean, we are not controlled by any of these. We are a public listed company with subject to control of no one, but this concept of significant shareholding, which is very common in FDI, is making these FDI authorities very alert and sometimes sending questionnaires which I cannot respond because they should be addressed to the shareholder. And sometimes I do. I mean, I ask the FDI authority if they can waive me to reach out to a company which is a third company for me. I have no idea what their intention is. So with regard to, so that's of course something that must be assessed and that of course it increases the chances of FDI filing. And with regard to the employees, absolutely, HR is never one of the work stream which is in the core team of an M&A deal, or if it is, it comes after during the integration. While now we are bringing them, of course, very early in the play, because we need to see whether some people could be considered key asset, key knowledge holder that we cannot retrench or whatever, or whether, and this we go a bit more later in the drafting of the contract, what covenants we can or cannot draft with regard to the fate of these employees in the interim period between signing and closing, and whether we can agree on a certain level of control without raising gun-jumping issues.
A couple of remarks again from our recent experience. Do not underestimate the interplay between the remedies imposed by the governments and their impact on the competition side. The duty of supply or some duty of supply you already mentioned, Julia, in some cases, especially if we are talking about the incumbent national operator, maybe can overlap with the one or two remedies, or may also integrate some kind of violation of competition law. One point. Second point, in a very recent case, in the Pirelli case in Italy, we assisted of a change, a heavy change of the rights of the majority shareholders in the possibility to exercise its control power due to the imposition of remedies by the Italian government. Is this led to a change of control relevant under merger control regulation? Actually, it's something that the European Commission, according to the information publicly available, send a request for information to the company and say, look, I received this information, please tell me more about this change of control, because you didn't notify it to the European Commission. So a lot of interplays, de facto, that should be taken into account when the object of this panel is in the early stage. So in the negotiation between the parties, be ready to have an open mind and a quick pen for writing. So, Julia, the next slide is exactly on this point, no? Yes,
that's the quick pen bit. So, at least 5 focal points in the contract. So, first of all, not all FDI and merger control regimes are assisted by standstill obligations, but most of them are, in which case a condition precedent is essential. Also, when there is no standstill obligation, parties might want to put in place a condition precedent because they expect that potential remedies can have an impact on the transaction, so they don't want to close before. So, condition precedent. Cooperation clause, irrespective of whether it's one party or the other that has the burden to make the filing. The parties, before closing the transactions, are independent companies, and they should remain independent companies. So they might want to put in the contracts cooperation clauses that allow exchanges of information in order to respond to RFIs by merger control and FDI authorities, or to fill out the filing. The third one is a tricky part, especially for in-house counsels. It's the long stop date. So concerning the long stop date, you have to be aware of the lead times of all notifications that are due and pick the longest, making it flexible to take into account that there might be rounds of requests for information, especially in FDI, because merger control have more of a set timeline. There is a phase 1, a phase 2. In FDI regimes, especially the oldest ones, usually there is a short waiting time, and then if it's problematic, there is the possibility to request information. But also, if we look at the 2019 FDI regulation in Europe, in case all the countries decide to react and to start a cooperation mechanism, and the EU Commission also gives its opinion, it might take around 70 days. So it's a lot more, and it's to take into account at early stage when dealing with a long stop date. Again, if you have standstill obligations, you also need to look at gun jumping clauses, especially when dealing with pre-closing covenants. And our advice is to limit the covenants to the strict necessity to protect the target business. And to take into account each case law of the relevant jurisdictions. I was giving an example before about the US jurisdiction that considers relevant in the pre-closing covenants as a gun jumping if consent of the acquirer is requested when dismissing employees, for example. And then last but really not least, and maybe the most important, is considering the likelihood and impact on potential remedies on the transactions, either to embed them in the contract or to have it ready for a later stage as a proposal to merger control authorities. But we also tried it with FDI authorities, and sometimes it works if you embed them. And the last bit is do not underestimate the impact of media. As we were stressing before, media can be responsible for the authorities picking up transactions that have not been notified, but also in terms of remedies might be very relevant.
we have a detailed slide here that has
Yes. Yes.
Okay, sorry. But you already explained that. Just for you all to know that the full set will include also these details. So it's time to see what are the real interactions. And so it's time for the next slide. Julia, maybe you can start from there. Interactions between FDI and merger control in practical terms. Marcello.
Maybe, yes, a couple of points here. We have said indeed that the timeline, so again, cannot stress it enough, guys, please. The remedies, so indeed the remedies can be negotiated in merger control, are slightly imposed in FDIs. From an in-house counsel perspective, again, coordinate with the different work stream, because these remedies may impact your finance department or your tax department, and maybe knowing that these remedies is actually possible to come, your finance department would say, I'm not going through with the transaction. So it's either a risk allocation clause or breakup fees, but some things they might seem very innocent from a lawyer perspective might have actually a very detrimental effect, especially because we say you have to live with those remedies, and in FDI you have to live for a period of time that is sometimes not very sure how much, and this might impact your business and your future transactions. So so maybe I will leave it again for the judicial review, which is for me the topic of the lawyers, absolutely.
Yeah, because before going into detail, until now we discussed about the physiological management of a complex M&A transaction. So if everything goes well at the end of the day, at the end of this long timeline, you will receive a clearance, or you will receive a clearance with conditions, or in a very remote probability of cases, a veto. Because at the end of the day, it's true that the scrutiny is very high. The high volume of transactions have been scrutinized in Europe so far, but at the end of the day, the powers have been exercised in a very, very low amount of cases, which is very close to the veto on merger control at the end of the day. But one of key features in Europe is the judicial review, both in merger control decisions and FDI decisions. So I think it's a very important, this point, because other jurisdictions like US, China, other countries in the East do not foresee the possibility to have a third independent view on the assessment. And this is one of the key points that we have in Europe, and Julia will briefly identify the commonalities and diversities among the two systems from the judicial review angle.
Yes. So the first and main difference is that in general, all around the world, merger control regimes tend to have the possibility of judicial review, while in FDI, let alone Europe, where we have the regulation that imposes a duty of member states to provide for a judicial review mechanism for FDI transactions, not all countries allow judicial review. And this is essentially because of this relationship between FDI and national sovereignty. Also, when this is allowed, the main obstacle to FDI judicial review is secrecy of the documents that is quite common in the FDI proceedings, and also in some cases a lack of procedural transparencies, because there are some phases of the FDI analysis that remain undercover. While for merger control, especially for merger control in Europe, procedural guarantees are very important also to judicial review, and it is very frequent to have litigation on competence or on the infringement of procedural requirements. But of course, since merger control and FDI scrutiny are both prospective analysis, in the sense that the FDI and competition authorities are foreseeing the future and not looking backwards, there is a degree of discretion that is difficult to litigate in both cases, although FDI and merger control authorities must use proportionality in their reasoning and also in imposing conditions or veto. So misuse of powers is usually a common grounds for judicial review. And at least in Europe, infringement of the treaties is a legal basis to both. Also, I'll just make reference to Xella case, which is a typical example of EU liberties applied also to the FDI screening. These are the main features for judicial review.
Thank you, Julia. We still have time for debate and for questions or curiosities you might have. Just a couple of minutes, so please raise your hand.
Thank you, Joanna Lennart from Maersk. So, from my perspective, FDI is something relatively new for the clients, for the business colleagues, right? I think across the years they sort of got used to the merger control. Okay, we need to look at the turnover, right? Then typically it's an acquisition of control, it could be creation of a joint venture, but it's pretty much defined, let's say. How do you deal with that? And this is a question for both of you. You know, Marcello, for you from your internal cuisine perspective, and Julia, for you as an outside counsel. How do you advise clients like, okay, could you give me a matrix? Could you give me a framework? What I should be looking at? Is there any threshold when it comes to the acquired shareholding? Any type of transaction? Do I need to look at specific countries? Do you have any tips on that? Because practically, I actually struggle with that myself. And my answer is not really satisfactory to my colleagues because I say, well, with everything you come to me, and then, you know, on a case-by-case basis, we'll look at this. But I'm wondering if you have something that could inspire me to give a better answer.
Take this off, potatoes?
I will, yes, I will try to. Yes, in order to, I would start from the relevant transaction type because for me is the most indicative. FDI regimes look at strategic assets. So any kind of act that changes the availability or the location or the control of the asset, for me should be at least mapped to see if it has any relevance from the FDI perspective. And also another proxy from the perspective of the relevant countries to take into account is the location of such asset, because usually it is where the asset is located would be the first FDI regime that comes into play. And also I would look at if it's actually an asset, I would look at the contractual relations. So if, for example, such asset is an infrastructure, I would ask to have a look through the contracts and see if there are public actors, for example, public entities that are given access to such infrastructures and so on, to identify the relevant countries. So once you identify, you map more or less the relevant acts and the relevant countries, there you look at the specific merger control regime to see if that asset is actually considered strategic based on the public information, so based on records. I would start from the transactions, going to the asset as a last stage, because this is really country-specific. Of course, in the EU, you have the list of the regulation, so critical infrastructures, data, energy, transports, communications, defense and national security. So that's really at the core. But what's around that area, I would start from identifying the relevant act and identify the relevant countries. Then you look at those country-specific legislation and you go through the strategic assets, I would say. Marcello, in your perspective?
Yeah, that would be very nice to do. No, of course. I mean, I think that's the way. Personally, so your finance master data in the company is divided between transactional and non-transactional information. The non-transactional information is where we need to look at because it's everything that is not the supply of goods and services. At Clariant, we have, I'm not saying that we have an automatic monitoring, but there is a sort of an alert system every time something is done with that is non-transactional, so there is a disposition of assets. So, and this also relates to intra-group, but me and you, we know what we're talking about, but we are not going to get there for the moment, otherwise we stay here till tomorrow. So, what I'm doing is that we have a few people responsible by country or by cluster of countries to change the information in the data, in the master data. And those people are normally trying to come, they try to come to me. The problem is that this is still pretty much after what's happening, so I'm trying to, put in place a sort of, okay, hold on, stand still. It's still a come to me scenario, so it's not very different from what you are. And on the other side, as Giulia said, a sort of an education and the training in, okay, guys, the most strategic assets. Luckily enough, at Clariant, our IP is fairly clean. It's in one location or mostly, so we don't deal with it. But when it comes to assets, of course, selling a reactor in one of our plants in South Africa, it's a reactor, it's a piece of machinery. Maybe not. I mean, South Africa is a better example, but I mean, so yes, there is a risk of not having exactly, and that's what I say in the reporting system. So there is a risk that some of these transactions will not get to your desk. But let's say by scrutinizing what's happening, you know where the trend is, and by educating, as Giulia said, the people, you might get there in time to do a filing before it's gone, before it's too late.
Just for the conclusion, I appreciated that Giulia and Marcello didn't answer in the most obvious way for a lawyer, which says, look the law, look the regulation, look the case law. Why? Because in this very matter, the law is very broad. The regulations, at the end of the day, brings you to a label, which is a very general one, mentioned already by Giulia, and the practice and the case law is very scant. We do have some judicial decisions already, but only on procedural aspects. But what is missing here is the famous and very useful database of the European Commission that we do have in merger control. Because as you know, you can research by code of activity, by parties, etc., etc. All this is non-existent in FDI. We are advocating from the academia to push the governments, not only in Italy, but also in Europe, to be more transparent here. But you can imagine that there is a lot of resistance, because in this opacity, in this not clarity, the doubt for lawyers, internal and external, but also for the business community, in a certain way facilitate the attraction of information from governments. And this is why, and I conclude on this point, this is why FDI is very fascinating, because it's law, but at the same time it's geopolitics and politics. And in our times, just remember the interesting words said by Mr. Letta yesterday, we are living a very challenging times, and this is the very, edge of the law in this very complex judicial and political framework. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention, for staying with us a little bit more of the expected time. And thanks to Giulia and Marcello for his excellent presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.